In forensic science, there is an unshakable rule. Every piece of evidence must have a logical explanation. A bloodstain can reveal where the victim fell. A footprint can show the direction of the killer's escape. And yet, sometimes reality bends logic, leaving behind a riddle with no answer for years on end. In the summer of 2017, during what should have been an ordinary archaeological excavation in the Appalachian Mountains, a group of students stumbled upon a fragment of human bone. It was a thoracic vertebra, pierced straight through by a blackened iron arrowhead primitive in design, the kind of weapon that had only existed in the mid-19th century. But the most horrifying discovery came later. DNA testing confirmed that the bone belonged to Haley Roberts, a 15-year-old girl who had mysteriously vanished in these very mountains back in 2007. A chilling question immediately arose. How could a teenager from the 21st century be killed with a weapon from 200 years ago? Was it the work of a madman, hiding deep within the forest, collecting relics of the past to commit unspeakable crimes? Or did the Appalachians themselves conceal a secret far beyond human understanding? To uncover the truth, we must travel back in time, to that bright summer morning when Haley and her best friend Brooklyn James strapped on their backpacks and left the safety of their campground. They believed it would be nothing more than a short hike, a quick adventure before lunch. But the Appalachian wilderness had other plans. It swallowed them whole, erasing every trace of their existence until, a decade later, one impossible piece of evidence clawed its way back to the surface. It was August 2007, the height of summer in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, where rolling green ridges stretched endlessly into the horizon and morning mist clung stubbornly to the valleys. The Roberts family had chosen this place for their final vacation before the school year began. For them, it was a chance to disconnect, to trade suburban routine for campfires and starry nights. 15-year-old Haley Roberts was thrilled to bring along her best friend, Brooklyn James. The two girls had been inseparable since elementary school. They shared secrets, homework struggles, and now, their first real hiking trip together. That morning, they brimmed with the excitement of adventure, their laughter carrying through the campground as they prepared to leave. Haley wore a bright blue backpack, stuffed with a bottle of water, a sandwich wrapped in foil, and her fully charged cell phone. Brooklyn carried a gray pack with similar supplies. They were dressed lightly: shorts, t-shirts, and hiking shoes. Nothing about their appearance suggested danger. In fact, they looked like any other pair of teenagers eager to conquer a trail and snap a few photos from the top. Their chosen destination was the Clingman's Dome Observation Tower, one of the most famous landmarks in the park. The trail leading there was considered moderately challenging but well-traveled, a safe choice for two energetic girls. Haley and Brooklyn assured Haley's parents they would be back by noon at the latest. With a cheerful wave, they stepped onto the path that wound toward the mountain, unaware it would be the last time anyone from their families saw them alive. Hours passed. At first, their absence raised no alarms. Hikers often lingered at scenic overlooks or underestimated how long a trail might take. But as the hands of the clock crept past 1 o'clock, then 1:30, Sarah Roberts began to feel unease knotting in her chest. She dialed her daughter's phone. It rang, but no one answered. She tried Brooklyn's number. Again, no response. By 2 o'clock, Sarah was calling every 10 minutes. Still nothing. The phones continued to ring, taunting with the possibility that the girls were simply distracted, too caught up in laughter to notice. Then, at precisely 3 p.m., both phones went dead. From that moment on, every call went straight to voicemail. The mountains are notorious for swallowing signals, but the timing was too precise, too sudden. Sarah's unease turned to panic. At 4 o'clock, Haley's father, Mark, drove to the trailhead parking lot. He scanned every face, approached hikers as they returned from the trail, and showed them photos of the girls. No one had seen them. By 5 o'clock, fear overpowered denial. The Roberts family reported both girls missing to park rangers. Names, descriptions, clothing, everything was recorded. The sun dipped behind the ridges, shadows stretched across the forest floor, and the temperature began to drop. Somewhere in the vast wilderness, Haley and Brooklyn had vanished. And the forest, indifferent and ancient, offered no clue as to where they had gone. In the beginning, the Roberts family clung to reason. Hikers were late all the time. Perhaps Haley and Brooklyn had taken an extended rest at the summit, or maybe they found a side path that delayed them. But by late afternoon, reason began to sound hollow. At 1:30 p.m., Sarah Roberts was already calling both phones in rotation. Haley's number rang for what felt like an eternity before dropping to silence. Brooklyn's phone did the same. No voices, no laughter, just unanswered calls echoing through the quiet of the campground. Sarah tried again, at 1:45, again at 2. Her voice grew more urgent with each voicemail she left. By 2:30, unease was spreading through the family like wildfire. Mark Roberts set down his coffee, muttering that he would drive up to the trailhead just in case. Sarah stayed behind, phone clutched in her hand, redialing every few minutes. At 3 sharp, everything changed. Both phones, which had at least been ringing before, now went dark. Every attempt was met with the cold, impersonal voice of voicemail. Sarah felt her stomach drop as if the ground had given way beneath her. In the Appalachians, cell service was patchy, yes, but for both devices to vanish from the grid at the exact same time? That felt deliberate. By 3:30, panic had taken hold. Sarah's hand shook as she scrolled through contacts, calling neighbors, relatives, anyone who might know something. But of course, no one did. Mark returned from the parking lot shortly after, his face tight. "No one saw them," he said simply. "Not a single hiker remembers passing 2 girls." His words were like stones falling into Sarah's chest. At 4 p.m., the Roberts' carefully constructed composure crumbled. They drove together to the ranger station, their voices trembling as they relayed every detail. The girls' names, their ages, what they were wearing, what color the backpacks were. The ranger on duty wrote everything down, his tone professional but grim. Missing hikers were not unusual in the Smokies, but missing teenage girls, with both phones going silent, was another matter entirely. By 5 p.m., the case was official. Haley Roberts and Brooklyn James were logged as missing persons in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. 2 rangers were dispatched immediately to patrol the trail leading to Klingman's Dome, equipped with flashlights and radios. As dusk settled and shadows deepened, the forest seemed to absorb the news in silence. The laughter of that morning felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Now only dread lingered in the cool mountain air, heavy and suffocating, as the first official search began. When the first rangers stepped onto the trail just after 5 p.m., the Smoky Mountains were already shifting into their evening mood. The forest grew darker with every passing minute, the once bright canopy, now a tangled ceiling of shadows. The rangers moved quickly, their flashlights slicing through the gloom, calling out the girls' names into the silence. "Haley, Brooklyn." The words echoed off the ridges, carried briefly by the wind, before dissolving into nothing. No reply came, only the rustle of leaves and the faint cry of a distant bird. By 7 p.m., reinforcements had arrived. 2 more rangers joined the first patrol, forming a small search party. They fanned out along the main trail, scanning the steep slopes that dropped off on either side. Occasionally, they stopped to peer into ravines, shining their lights on twisted roots and dark hollows, hoping for a scrap of fabric or a glint of metal from a backpack zipper. But the forest gave them nothing. That night, temperatures plummeted. What had been a warm summer afternoon turned into a chilling mountain night. The searchers continued until nearly midnight before regrouping at the trailhead. Their report was grim. No footprints, no belongings, no sign of 2 teenage girls. At dawn, a full-scale search was launched. The headquarters was established at the Park Service office, where maps of the Smokies were unrolled across tables. Officers marked grids with thick black pens, dividing the area into sectors. Each team would cover a section roughly half a square mile in size, ensuring that no ground went unchecked. By mid-morning, more than 60 people were involved: rangers, sheriff's deputies, and trained search and rescue volunteers. Helicopters were called in, hovering low with thermal imaging cameras scanning the canopy. but the dense foliage was a wall of green, impenetrable to the sensors. From above, the forest looked like an endless carpet, smooth and uniform, concealing whatever secrets it held beneath. On the ground, K9 units were deployed. Handlers unclipped leashes at the trailhead, and 2 German shepherds lowered their noses to the earth. Almost immediately, they picked up the girl's scent and pulled their handlers forward, leading the way down the trail with determined strides. For a mile and a half, the dogs followed confidently, tails wagging, energy high. Then, at a sharp bend in the trail, something changed. The dogs veered suddenly into the underbrush, yanking their handlers off the path. They pushed through thorny branches and thick ferns, pulling until they reached a small clearing 200 yards from the trail. There, the animals circled frantically, whining, their noses darting in all directions. The scent trail ended abruptly, as if the girls had vanished into thin air. The handlers tried repeatedly to redirect them, to push them further into the woods, but the dogs only returned to the clearing, restless and confused. Rangers marked the site with tape, noting it as the first tangible clue in the case. Yet it was not a comforting discovery. It was unsettling, almost supernatural. How could 2 healthy teenagers walk into a clearing and leave no trace behind? Search teams pressed on through the day, climbing rocky outcroppings, wading through creeks, and rappelling down steep slopes. Volunteers combed the forest floor for broken branches, candy wrappers, or the smallest thread of cloth. Every hour, teams radioed back their positions, only to report the same result: nothing. As night fell once more, floodlights were set up at the trailhead, and weary searchers gathered around campfires to warm their hands. Their faces were drawn, their eyes hollow. The mountains had swallowed Haley and Brooklyn whole, and the more they searched, the more impossible it seemed to find them. The Smokies, vast and ancient, kept its secrets close, and for now, it was not willing to give them up. By the 3rd day, the disappearance of Haley Roberts and Brooklyn James was no longer treated as a routine case of lost hikers. The sheer absence of clues, the vanished scent trail, the failure of helicopters, the silence of the forest forced authorities to escalate. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was called in. When FBI agents arrived, they transformed the operation. The command post swelled with new personnel, forensic experts, analysts, and seasoned investigators who had worked on abduction cases before. Pinboards were erected, plastered with photographs of the girls, maps of the area, and handwritten timelines. Every known detail of their lives was scrutinized. Agents interviewed the Roberts and James families again, searching for hidden conflicts, secret boyfriends, or signs that the girls might have staged their own disappearance. But nothing emerged. Haley and Brooklyn were ordinary teenagers, bright, well-behaved, with no indication of wanting to run away. The FBI also canvassed the campground and surrounding trails, questioning every registered tourist. They cross-checked visitors against criminal databases, especially those with a history of crimes against children. Dozens of names were flagged, but each was methodically cleared. Not one person had seen or heard anything unusual that morning. Meanwhile, ground searches intensified. Over 150 people now combed nearly 20 square miles, a scale rarely seen in the Smoky Mountains. They rappelled into ravines, crawled into caves, and scoured riverbeds. Volunteers carried photographs, showing them to hikers in hopes of sparking recognition. Yet not a single backpack, shoe, or torn scrap of fabric surfaced. It was as though the forest had erased the girls completely. Wildlife experts were consulted. Could a bear attack have dragged them away? The answer was a firm no. Bear attacks left chaos in their wake: blood, shredded clothing, drag marks. Here, there was nothing. After 10 relentless days, fatigue set in. Searchers were bruised, scratched, and hollow-eyed. Families clung to hope, but even the most determined volunteers admitted defeat. The operation was scaled down, downgraded from an active rescue mission to periodic patrols. The official narrative was cold and unsatisfying. The girls had likely suffered an accident somewhere deep in the backcountry, their remains hidden in places too remote to find. But among the investigators, an unspoken truth lingered. People don't simply vanish from a clearing without leaving a trace. The case was filed under cold, sealed in the archives. For Haley and Brooklyn's families, it was not closure but a wound left open, festering with questions. After the search was scaled down, time became the cruelest enemy. Days blurred into weeks, then months, and soon years. For the Roberts and James families, life continued only in appearance. Outwardly, they worked, cooked dinners, and attended school events for their other children. Inwardly, every breath carried the weight of uncertainty. Haley's bedroom remained untouched, her bright blue backpack still hanging on the chair, a silent reminder of the day she left and never returned. Brooklyn's parents refused to repaint her room, leaving posters of her favorite bands and the half-finished homework on her desk exactly as they had been in August 2007. Both families lived in limbo, torn between hope and despair, unable to hold funerals without bodies, unable to move on without answers. Every year on the anniversary of their disappearance, the families gathered at the base of Clingman's dome. They lit candles and left flowers, joined by friends and sympathetic strangers. Reporters occasionally returned, cameras capturing the tearful vigils before fading back into silence. As time passed, the media's interest waned, but the family's grief never did. In the community, the case grew into legend. Campers whispered about the two girls who vanished without a trace. Cautionary tales passed around campfires to warn children not to wander off the trail. The Smoky Mountains seemed to hold them hostage, a secret locked away by trees older than memory. For investigators, the file gathered dust. New cases demanded attention. New tragedies pushed the Roberts-James disappearance further into the background. But for their parents, every unanswered call, every knock on the door, carried a flicker of irrational hope that maybe, somehow, the girls would come back. For 10 long years, that hope kept them alive. But hope, like the forest itself, can be both a comfort and a torment. It was May 2017 when the silence finally broke, not through police work, but by pure chance. In the Nantahala National Forest, only a few dozen miles from Clingman's Dome, a team of archaeology students from East Tennessee State University began their summer field project. Their task was straightforward: excavate the remains of a 19th-century fur trading camp, document artifacts, and add to the region's historical record. For weeks, the students unearthed rusty nails, shards of pottery, fragments of buttons, and bones from animals consumed long ago. Each discovery was carefully logged, tagged, and bagged. It was meticulous work, hardly the kind of endeavor that usually makes headlines. But on a warm afternoon, while clearing soil near what had once been a fire pit, one student's trowel scraped against something solid. Brushing away the dirt, she froze. It was a bone, clearly human. More than that, it was a vertebra, and lodged directly through its center was an iron arrowhead. The arrowhead was unmistakably old, broad, two-bladed, with a short tang. The professor leading the dig, Dr. Alan Carlisle, recognized it as a design used by hunters in the mid-1800 seconds. At first glance, the find made perfect sense in a 19th century campsite, but the bone itself told a different story. It was far too light in color, lacking the mineralization expected of something buried for over a century. It didn't carry the same dark stains or fossilization seen in the other bones at the site. To Carlyle's trained eye, it looked as though it had been underground for no more than a decade. Per protocol, the excavation was halted immediately, and the discovery was reported to the sheriff's office. Within days, the vertebra and arrowhead were transported to the North Carolina State Forensic Laboratory. There, pathologists conducted a full examination. The results were startling. The bone was confirmed to be human, belonging to a teenager. The trajectory of the arrow wound suggested a frontal shot, penetrating the vertebra and almost certainly striking vital organs, a fatal injury. The next step was DNA testing. A sample of marrow was extracted, processed, and entered into the national database. Months passed as the backlog of cases slowed progress. Then, in October 2017, the match came back. The bone belonged to Haley Roberts. The news hit like a thunderclap. After 10 years of silence, a single vertebra surfaced, carrying with it both confirmation and confusion. Confirmation, because Haley was no longer missing, She had been killed. Confusion, because the weapon that ended her life belonged to another century. Investigators reopened the case immediately, pulling retired agents back into the fold. But instead of solving the mystery, the discovery only deepened it. Who in 2007 would be using a 150-year-old hunting arrow? Why had only one bone surfaced? And, most haunting of all, what had happened to Brooklyn James? The forest had finally yielded a fragment of truth, but it was wrapped in a paradox. For every question answered, 3 more were born. With the discovery of Haley's vertebra, the cold case roared back to life. Detectives who had retired were summoned, FBI agents were reassigned, and the Appalachian wilderness once again swarmed with search teams. But this time, the goal was not rescue, it was recovery and answers. The site of the archaeological dig became the new center of operations. For 3 weeks, the forest within a 5-mile radius was combed with near-obsessive precision. Teams of officers and volunteers swept the area yard by yard. Specialized cadaver dogs were brought in, trained to detect the faintest scent of human decomposition. Geologists deployed ground-penetrating radar to locate hidden graves or soil disturbances that might conceal a burial. Every possible tool of modern forensics was employed. And yet, nothing surfaced. No additional bones, no scraps of clothing, no sign of Brooklyn. Just the single vertebra pierced by an arrowhead that belonged to the wrong century. Theories sprang up. Some believed wild animals might have scattered Haley's remains across the wilderness, leaving only one bone behind by sheer chance. Others argued that the killer had staged the discovery deliberately, planting the vertebra near the dig site to confuse investigators and taunt law enforcement. But whichever theory one favored, it didn't bring them closer to the truth. FBI profilers attempted to sketch the outline of a suspect. The use of a primitive weapon suggested someone living outside society's norms, perhaps a member of a secluded cult, a historical reenactor gone mad, or a survivalist who had rejected modern life. Agents combed records of every reenactment group, every primitive living community along the East Coast. They dug into the purchase histories of antique weapon collectors, searching for rare arrowheads. Nothing matched. For more than a year, the investigation sputtered forward, generating endless paperwork but no breakthroughs. The paradox remained unsolved. A modern teenager, killed with an ancient weapon, her body vanished except for a single, inexplicable bone. By late 2018, even the most determined agents admitted the case had stalled. The Appalachian forest had yielded one chilling clue, only to close its grip tighter on the rest of the truth. It was June 2019 when the case took a sudden and terrifying turn. Deep in the woods of Jackson County, a seasoned hunter named David Gaines set out to check one of his remote camera traps. He had hunted these mountains for decades, knew every trail, every ridge and creek. But that day, the forest gave him something he had never seen before. As he pushed through dense undergrowth, a sharp crack of branches snapped nearby. Expecting to flush out a deer, Gaines froze. Instead, a figure emerged from the trees. A man, barefoot and ragged, his hair and beard matted into wild tangles. His clothes were little more than stitched-together scraps of dark fabric, possibly animal skins. In one hand he carried a crude wooden bow, in the other, a spear tipped with a roughly carved stone. The hunter's instincts told him immediately. This was not a camper or a lost hiker. This was someone who had been living outside society for years, maybe decades. The man's eyes were what unnerved Gaines most. They were wide, unblinking, feral. He did not speak. Instead, he let out a series of guttural sounds, half growls, half howls, that sent a chill through the hunter's bones. Then, without warning, the man lunged forward, jabbing the spear in short, threatening motions, as though testing whether Gaines would fight or flee. Gaines, a veteran of countless hunts, understood that sudden movement could trigger violence. Slowly, carefully, he raised his empty hands to show he meant no harm. The wild man growled again, teeth bared, but did not close the distance. Step by step, Gaines backed away, heart hammering, until the forest swallowed the figure from view. The moment he reached his truck, Gaines sped straight to the nearest sheriff's office. His report was detailed. precise, he even marked the coordinates of the encounter on a map. To local law enforcement, it was disturbing but puzzling. To the FBI team still struggling with the Roberts-James mystery, it was electrifying. A man living primitively in the mountains, armed with ancient-style weapons. For the first time in 12 years, they had a lead that fit the impossible clue buried in Haley's bone. Plans for a tactical search began immediately. The report from David Gaines reached the FBI task force within hours. For the first time in more than a decade, investigators had a lead that felt solid, tangible. A man living in the forest like a ghost from another century. Armed with crude weapons, everything about it resonated with the baffling arrow found lodged in Haley Roberts' vertebra. A tactical team was assembled almost overnight. 12 members of the state police's special response unit, along with 2 Jackson County deputies, were deployed to the coordinates Gaines had marked. Their orders were clear: approach silently, contain the area, and capture the individual alive if possible. At dawn, the unit left their vehicles behind and trekked miles into the forest on foot. They moved in silence, their boots sinking into mossy ground, radios muted except for hand signals. For 2 tense hours they advanced, until the first signs of habitation appeared: crude snares, strung between trees, animal bones scattered around half-burned fire pits, and a faint trail worn down by bare feet. The trail led them to a cluster of thick rhododendron bushes. Pushing through, they found the ruins of an old hunting lodge, its roof sagging, walls blackened by time and damp. But inside, movement flickered. Someone was there. The team fanned out, encircling the cabin. Through the cracks in the walls, shadows shifted a man rising from a bed of leaves. The commander gave the signal. The breach was swift and violent. Officers stormed in from 2 sides, weapons trained, voices booming commands. The figure inside sprang up with surprising speed, grabbing a spear propped against the wall. He roared not words but guttural sounds and lunged. Within seconds, however, he was overwhelmed, tackled, and handcuffed. His strength was considerable, but no match for trained professionals. The man was dragged out into the morning light, thrashing, snarling like a cornered animal. He did not speak. Not a single coherent word passed his lips. Once he was secured and evacuated, forensic teams moved in to examine the cabin. What they found turned the case from a mystery into a nightmare. The interior was primitive but functional. Clay pots, stone knives, clothing stitched crudely from animal hides. On a makeshift bed lay a piece of cloth, dirty and frayed, but still recognizable, a blue and green plaid pattern. Investigators froze. It matched the skirt Brooklyn James had been wearing the day she disappeared. Next to the bed, tangled in a nest of furs, were long strands of dark hair. Later DNA analysis would confirm it. Brooklyn's. The walls were smeared with charcoal drawings, crude figures of 2 girls with long hair, always depicted with arms crossed over their chests in a ritualistic pose. Some images were repeated dozens of times, covering every surface like a manic obsession. The most grotesque discovery lay beneath the floorboards. A trapdoor led down into a shallow cellar. Hanging from the ceiling, suspended by twisted tendons, was a desiccated human hand. Small, delicate, unmistakably female. The cabin told a story too horrifying to deny. Whoever this man was, he had been directly involved in the fate of Haley Roberts and Brooklyn James, and the nightmare was only beginning to unravel. Back at the county jail, the feral man was booked and fingerprinted. He remained silent, thrashing and growling whenever guards approached, his eyes darting wildly as though he were trapped in an invisible nightmare. He refused food for days, drinking only when water was left unattended in his cell. Communication seemed impossible. But fingerprint analysis provided the first breakthrough. A few days later, the results came back. The man was identified as Dennis Ricks, a North Carolina native who had been listed as missing since 1996. At the time of his disappearance, he had been only 16 years old, a troubled teenager who had run away from a juvenile shelter. For more than 2 decades, he had vanished from every radar, living in complete isolation within the Appalachian wilderness. Psychiatric evaluations soon followed. Doctors diagnosed him with severe schizophrenia, accompanied by paranoid delusions. Years of solitude had eroded whatever tether he had left to reality. His mind was fragmented, consumed by hallucinations and rituals of his own making. Yet beneath the madness, shards of memory remained dark, broken pieces of the truth. During long and carefully managed sessions, when sedation dulled his aggression just enough, investigators were able to coax words from him, not coherent narratives, but fragments. He muttered about intruders and noise. They came into my home, they laughed. I told them to leave, they didn't. I took the arrow. One first, then another. One I carried away. The other stayed. She had to be cleansed. The statements were chilling, but also cryptic. Piece by piece, investigators reconstructed what had likely happened. Haley and Brooklyn, straying from the trail, had stumbled upon Ricks's hidden dwelling. In his distorted perception, they were invaders violating the sanctity of his world. When they laughed, perhaps nervously, perhaps innocently, he interpreted it as mockery, a threat. The arrow he mentioned was no mystery. Investigators believed he had scavenged antique arrowheads from the forest, remnants of history scattered in the soil, and crafted them into crude weapons. With one, he fatally shot Haley, the blow piercing her spine. The second he kept, referring to Brooklyn dragging her back to the cabin, where she endured captivity and unspeakable rituals. The fragments didn't provide closure. Instead, they confirmed the worst. The mystery of the arrow was no time-bending paradox, but the tragic consequence of crossing paths with a mind long broken by isolation. When the case finally went to court, there was little question about Dennis Ricks's involvement. The evidence from the cabin, the fabric from Brooklyn's skirt, the strands of her hair, the grotesque, mummified hand spoke more loudly than any testimony. Yet the trial was less about guilt and more about capacity. Doctors unanimously declared Ricks legally insane, incapable of understanding the nature of his actions. He was sentenced not to prison, but to lifelong confinement in a maximum security psychiatric facility. For the families, the verdict was bittersweet. They had long begged for answers, for any trace of what had happened in those woods. Now, they had pieces of the truth, but no real closure. Haley's remains consisted only of a single vertebra pierced by an ancient arrow. Brooklyn's body was never found, only fragments of her existence scattered in a cabin of horrors. There was no opportunity for a proper burial, no chance to lay flowers on a grave. At vigils held in their memory, neighbors spoke of resilience and community, but the parents knew that resilience was a mask. Behind it lived the same haunting questions. How many nights had Brooklyn survived in that cabin? What did she endure before the end? Could anything have been done differently to save them? In the wider community, the story of the Roberts James disappearance transformed from a cautionary tale into a chilling legend. For years, campers had whispered about the girls who vanished without a trace. Now the truth was revealed, but it was almost harder to accept than the mystery itself. It wasn't supernatural forces or curses of the Smokies that had taken the girls. It was something far more terrifying. A human being, broken and feral, consumed by madness and the wilderness. The Appalachian Mountains remain beautiful, vast, and indifferent. They shelter countless species, streams, and trails, but they also harbor secrets, waiting for unlucky wanderers to stumble upon them. The disappearance of Haley Roberts and Brooklyn James is no longer unsolved, but its echoes linger. It is a story of innocence destroyed, of families condemned to grief, and of the dark truth that sometimes the most frightening monsters are not creatures of legend, but people who have lost themselves completely to the wild. And in the quiet rustle of the forest, that truth still whispers. If you found this story haunting and want to hear more mysteries of those who vanished without a trace, don't forget to subscribe to Last Seen. Every week, we uncover new cases, lost stories, and chilling truths hidden in plain sight. Hit the bell icon so you never miss the next disappearance.